Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the International Guild of Battlefield Guides. And tonight we're going to be talking about cracking the Hindenburg Line and the Battle of Arras of 1918. So, two things of interesting note. You'll notice that I've got a very colorful banner this time on the side of the screen. And that is because this attack involves all four of the divisions of the Canadian Corps fighting at different times in the same battle. And so the red one is the first division, the blue is second, the gray is the third division, and the green is the fourth division. And I played a nice ode to the fifth division, which is the maroon color at the bottom, the division that actually never went into any battles. The photo on the right-hand side of this presentation, you will see is Canadian infantrymen moving up through near the village of Remy, which is part of this battlefield. They're in some low ground and swamp, and that's an actual photo from the battle itself. So a quick disclaimer, MFS Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies or products that I talk about in this presentation. They're not sponsored, nor do they sponsor or endorse any of these companies or anything that's named in this company that I use in the presentation. These are all companies that I recommend to you because they're the ones that I use as a guide and I take people to because they have certain features that will help you on your travels. So we're going to talk quickly about the country overview. We're going to talk about some recommended preparations and some travel advisories, some helpful hints that are very important, especially visiting First World War battlefields, some must-try food and treats, which is always very important, especially when you're in France, the best places to stay in Arras, transportation, which is always a challenge on battlefields. And then we're going to talk quickly about the Battle of Arras itself, like the whole overview from the 26th of September to the 5th of September, 1918, and get you set up for the battles. And then we're going to talk about its two phases, the Battle of the Scarpe from the 26th to the 30th of September, and then the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant line from the 2nd to the 3rd of September 1918. And then we're going to talk about some places that are worth mentioning and possibly seeing, and then I'll take your questions. So the photo on that side is actually a Canadian tank, although it is French. They were used by brigade commanders and brigade staffs to run around the battlefield in armored protection. That is the 11th Canadian Brigade headquarters on the Arras-Cambrai Road, waiting to move up. So what are we talking about? We're talking about France. That's where Arras is. It's in the Artois region and the Pas-de-Calais. Its population is about 42,600 people. Of course, they speak French. The main international airport into France to get here is Paris-Charles de Gaulle. You can actually train from Paris-Charles de Gaulle to Arras quite conveniently. And that's your international one. You could fly into Belgium through Brussels, but it's a little bit harder. Quick background to the town of Arras. It was founded in antiquity, and it used to have a Roman garrison, and it's existed throughout the Middle Ages. It was only ceded to France in 1640 from the Holy Roman Empire. It is also the birthplace of Maximilien Robespierre of the French Revolution. It has a Vauban-built citadel and once had what we call ramparts, so very thick city walls that could be defended. The city, throughout the entire First World War, was between 1 and 10 kilometers at most from the front lines for the entire battles of the First World War. So France is the 10th most expensive country in Europe, sorry. So it's a little bit higher than your average for prices for food, hotels, things like that. Some cool facts. There's actually been 7 battles of Arras: 1640, 1653, 1914, 1915, 1917, 1918, and 1940. And there's a memorial to the missing in Arras with 35,000 names just from the 1917 and 18 battles alone, as well as there is the Air Service Memorial for those that are in the Air Force. To the missing, there's about 1,000 names. And between the two of them, there's 11 Victoria Cross recipients listed on the two memorials. So, recommended preparations. The Pas-de-Calais is generally a mild climate with wet, cool winters and warm, dry summers. Most of the places that I go have this type of pleasant weather because I don't like to travel to bad places. The best time to travel to this region is the end of April to the middle of November. This time of year can be very wet, especially from about the beginning of December till about the beginning of April. It's very wet and muddy. It can be hard to get to some of the locations. A rain jacket is always a good idea to have. It helps break the wind. but you also need really good footwear. Where we're talking about today is a lot of really cool trails and spots kind of off the beaten track, and you kind of need good footwear to get there. Always travel with medical insurance and travel insurance. You never know what's going to go wrong. All the memorials and cemeteries are child friendly, and most places in the area are. I've never had any problems bringing my children to Arras. They really love the city. It's a really cool place. And to give you some perspective, the photo of this one is the Vauban Star Fort at Arras. That's called the Citadel of Arras. And not far from there is where the two memorials are, the Air Services and the Arras Memorial to the Missing. And there's also city passes for Arras, which is kind of convenient and nice. So always check your travel advisories from the government of Canada. You never know that these things change. So always refresh them if you're traveling. There are no COVID restrictions. They've all been lifted, which is really awesome. Visa and entry requirements. There's none if you're coming from the EU, but there is a 90-day maximum stay if you're coming from Canada. So security considerations. Petty crime is always a risk. Generally, Artois is quite safe. I've never had any issues there. I've never known any guides to have any issues there. But France is always at risk of terrorism. France seems to have a higher incidence of that these days. There is a hospital in Arras, which is convenient. The emergency number is 112. The closest embassy in France, and the only one or consulate, is in Paris. So some helpful tips. Always dress for the weather. You're not far from the sea, and it can get really chilly really fast and really windy really fast. Last time I was on this battlefield, it looked like it was going to be great, and then the winds jumped up to 80 kilometers an hour. So you just got to be careful. The weather can change very quickly. Please don't climb on any monuments or memorials. That's exactly what they are. They are either monuments to individuals, because some of them are privately raised by family members for their fallen. They're memorials to the fallen, or they're memorials raised by units to commemorate where they were, in some cases originating from the First World War itself. So, and sometimes they will have ashes spread around them, so just be considerate of that. Please remember that you are visiting someone's home. This is where they live, they work, this is their property. And to allow us to keep visiting, we really need people to be respectful and not block roads and go places and damage their property. This is my very important talk about the First World War. Be aware that many of the fields contain war remains, and do not touch them. They are exceptionally dangerous, and they're becoming more unstable as time passes. And this battlefield, the Battle of Arras 1918, was noted for its use of mustard gas quite heavily by the British and the Canadians, because Canada used a lot of gas. And those shells are becoming more and more unstable as time progresses, and so it's a real concern. And I will show you two incidents. This is me on the Somme, about 30 kilometers from where we're talking about. So the first shell, which is the one on the bottom, was the one I almost parked on with a tour in September, which was awesome because we walked around and did all this stuff, and the person said, "Isn't that a shell?" And I then backed up the truck. And the other one is where I was telling a week later my tour group that we needed to be careful of these things and to keep their eyes peeled. And they said, like the one that you just parked beside, and then I had to drive away. So these things are very for real, and they exist all over. So please don't touch them. So must try food and treats. This is Arras. I love Le Comptoir. It's my favorite restaurant of all time in Arras. My family goes there. It was the first restaurant we went there, and the service is great. The food is amazing. I can't say it's between the Grand Place and the Place des Héros in the town of Arras. And I mean, there's lots of restaurants there, but that is a one I would highly recommend. I also recommend Le 58 if you have gluten or food allergies or dietary restrictions. Le 58, which is attached to the Mercure Hotel, not far from the train station. Wonderful food, great service, good prices, and lots of options. It's actually listed as a gluten-free restaurant. Now, for those that like beer, perhaps, Le Capsule is just 2 stalls down from Le Comptoir, in that little corridor between the two places, and it has like 80 or 90 beers on the wall. Great, it's inexpensive. You can, and it's got this little great atmosphere. So after a day of touring the battlefield, if you want good food and drink, this is the spot to go. So where do I stay when I go to Arras? Well, I prefer to stay at the Holiday Inn Express. You can get breakfast included. It's clean. It's really close to the train station. It's easy access to both the northern battlefields, Vimy Ridge, Lens, Hill 70, the Battle of Arras, where we're talking about today, as well as down south to the Somme and Beaumont-Hamel. So it's really convenient to get there, and it's actually just a very clean, wonderful hotel, great staff, great service, and they have parking. Beside them is the Hotel Mercure. It's the other recommendation. I have stayed here. I have used it. It's a little bit more expensive. It does have the restaurant, a nicer restaurant attached to it, which is Le 58. Both are within walking distance of the train station, 10 minutes to the two squares, lots of food and drink options, again, parking. That's where I would stay when I go to Arras. I've used a few other smaller hotels or different hotel chains, and these are the two that I would recommend to use, especially the Holiday Inn Express. So there's no ride services in Arras. There's only traditional taxi service, and there is a bus service. And I've used a taxi when I first came to Arras to go to Vimy Ridge. So it is doable, pricey, but doable. There are lots of tour guides. You can find lots online. There's some in towns. There's many around, but two good sources for them. The Gilded Battlefield Guides, which I'm a member of, has a whole list of amazing guides that are quite spectacular and quite well ranged in their knowledge. And of course, Woolsey's War Walks, which is me. I'm also excellent. I specialize in Canadian First and Second World War, and I spend a lot of time on the battlefields. So we are talking about the Battle of Arras, 1918. So this battle, at the beginning of August 1918, the Canadians fought the Battle of Amiens. So they had been moved secretly from actually in front of Arras down to Amiens. Secretly, the Germans did not know they were there, and they launched this massive attack on the 8th of August 1918, the black day for the German army. They advanced 8 miles in a single day. They punched this huge hole in the German lines. It completely devastated them. But after 3 or 4 days of fighting, it bogged down into traditional. They'd outstripped their guns. The tanks had broken down. Things had just gone wrong. So General Haig stopped the attack. Now, the Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch, of all the Allied armies, had planned that he was going to start hitting the Germans hammer blow after hammer blow from different locations. And he really wanted Haig to keep pushing. Haig said no, and he had a different plan. So he moved the Canadian Corps from Amiens back into the Arras sector, not long after their fighting had ended at Amiens. Normally, after such large battles, such as the Battle of Amiens, most corps were given a chance to rest and refit, absorb replacements, and retrain. But this time, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig knew that he needed to keep up pressure on the Germans and hit them again. But this time in a different sector to keep driving them back out of France and Belgium. And that was the Allied strategy. Different attacks a day or two apart in different parts of the front so their reserves would run around. The 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions moved out of Amiens first, departing on the 19th and the night of the 19th and 20th, and then the 20th and 21st of August respectively. And by the 23rd and the 24th of August, they were back in Arras. That's about almost 80 kilometers. And they were getting ready for their next attack. They were followed later by the 1st Canadian Division that arrived on the 25th of August and the 4th Division, which arrived on the 28th of August, after the battle had actually already started. So, and they were planned to do the follow-on divisions for the 2nd and 3rd as this attack was going to progress. In order to make the Canadian Corps more full and complete, because it didn't have all of its divisions, the 51st Highland Division was assigned to the Canadian Corps, but on the northern bank of the River Scarpe, which is the river at the top of the map here, and to cooperate with the attack. And then the British 4th Division, which is a British regular division, was attached into the Canadian Corps until the arrival of the 4th Canadian Division, which does get confusing because at one point in this battle, the 4th British Division and the 4th Canadian Division are fighting side by side. Now, the main objective of this was to break through what was considered the most formidable part of the Hindenburg Line. Now, the Hindenburg Line was a series of defenses built after the Battle of the Somme by the Germans because they realized they could not hold on to every piece of ground, and they'd been bled dry, and they needed this formidable 8-mile deep set of defenses that would just bog down any attacker. And so what they did was they created all these concrete bunkers and pillboxes and machine gun posts and barbed wire entanglements that were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of yards long, but 30 to 40 deep, spaced every 50 or 60 yards or 100 yards, depending how it is. These thick nests of barbed wire. They literally were trying to build, as if anybody's ever done any of my tours, Germans seem to like building defensive lines. And so we're going to talk about these lines. And I'm going to talk about the Artois switch, the Drocourt-Queant line, and those are trench lines. They're usually made up of 3 trenches, first, second, and third in the German front, support, reserve in the British concept. And some of these lines, so a line usually goes north-south, and the switches connect the two, those two, like the second and third and fourth lines all together. And so this is quite a significant thing. On this map, all the gray, the light gray areas that have like our V on our Artois switch and Hindenburg line, those are all the trench lines, kind of roughly simulating where they are. And they are huge. This is a formidable defense. And the Allies knew this because when they built the Hindenburg line and when they came into this particular sector, this area had been fought over in 1917 in the Battle of Arras. The British had fought almost to Cambrai, or pretty much to Cambrai. In the 1918, the Germans counterattacked and pushed them all the way back to Arras. So this front line, this battlefield, is old British trenches, old German trenches, new fortifications. It is a big, messy battlefield. So the British really knew what they were going to be getting into, and so did the Canadians, because they had spent from the end of the Battle of Passchendaele until the Battle of Amiens in the same sector. So we're talking now, the first action of this is the Battle of the Scarpe, which took place from the 26th to the 30th of August, 1918. The Battle of the Scarpe is the opening action for the Canadian Corps in the Battle of Arras, 1918, and was launched by the 3rd Canadian Division north of the Arras-Cambrai Road, today the D939, which you can still drive down, to the Scarpe River in the north, attacking with the 8th Canadian Brigade using the 5th, 2nd, and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles from the road north to the river, with the 1st Battalion Canadian Mounted Rifles in support, and then the 2nd Canadian Division south of that same road to the village of Nouvelle Vitasse, attacking with the 4th Canadian Brigade, 20th and 21st Battalions attacking, and the 18th and 19th in support, and beside them, the 6th Canadian Brigade, with the 29th, 28th, and 27th going into the attack, and the 26th in support. And the start time for this attack was at 3 a.m. And there was no preliminary bombardment. There was none of the traditional, we're going to bombard you for a week and drop 4 million shells like we did at Passchendaele. There was just going to be the opening fire of artillery, timed for the exact same moment the troops were stepping out of the trenches, so that the creeping barrage was literally the first notice the Germans had. It was a new technique. It was to gain the act of surprise, because this is very flat, big, open ground. And you can see that because the top left-hand photo is the shell bursting over the village of Monchy just before it's captured. It's one of the objectives of this fight. It's advancing east of Arras. Those are Canadians there. And those are troops in there from the 1st or 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. So it's dominated by a couple of hills. Monchy-le-Preux is on top of one of them. If anybody knows anything about the Newfoundlanders, there's actually a Newfoundland memorial in Monchy-le-Preux. But they didn't fight in this battle. That's from a different, earlier battle. So the only way they had surprise was to literally spring it on the Germans. The 6th Canadian Brigade attack began and met very little resistance as they finished clearing Nouvelle Vitasse and continued their advance. And the 4th Canadian Brigade attacked a German outpost line, meeting almost no resistance. And by 6 a.m., the 20th Battalion had reached a feature called Chapel Hill, which is one of the hills in front of Monchy-le-Preux on the Arras-Cambrai Road. The 21st Battalion had reached the village of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Ruape, and they were stopped short of it just by heavy fire coming from the village of Monchy-le-Preux, which was one of the primary objectives of the opening fight. At 10:30 a.m., the battlefield changed because the boundary between the 1st British Army, the Canadian Corps, 2nd Canadian Division in the south, and the British 3rd Army, 17th Corps, 52nd Lowland Division, shifted south from where it was, making the Canadian battlefield wider, which is going to cause some challenges. And the reason for that was the Canadians had to burst into this area, and then they would make the battlefield wider because they had some narrow points they had to cross. And so it really was actually helping a British attack farther south in the 4th Army. So everybody had to shift their boundaries south to make it all work. The 27th and the 28th Battalions attacked towards the village of Wancourt and crossed the river Cajol, where they captured Wallencourt Tower, which is a big water tower just outside of the town. And they were hit by fire and found uncut barbed wire positions and were forced to dig in after spending most of the day in front of it, short of their actual final objective for the day. And early on the morning of the 27th of August, they actually made a silent attack, so no artillery bombardment, no warning whatsoever. They literally stormed and captured the position that was their final objective, a place called Egret Trench, and they secured that and the start line for the next attacks. The 3rd Canadian Division in the north was aimed at a feature called Orange Hill, which was about 60 feet above the surrounding area and gradually sloped towards the River Scarpe, giving excellent observation. The 4th CMR advanced along the river because Major General Lipsett, the division commander, decided that he was going to attack it from the backside. 4th CMR was followed by 2nd CMR, who took the hill from the north and securing this vital piece of ground. They were passed through and to the south by 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles and 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles, who then attacked the village of Monchy-le-Preux and from the north and the west concurrently and secured it by 7 in the morning. Sorry, by 7:30 in the morning. Lieutenant C.S. Rutherford, Military Cross, Military Medal of the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles, performed actions that led him to be awarded the Victoria Cross this day when he captured 70 prisoners, captured several machine gun positions single-handedly, and he survived. So I said that top photo is the Canadians just before they're going into Monchy-le-Preux. The 7th Canadian Brigade came forward and through the 8th Canadian Brigade with the PPCLI and the Royal Canadian Regiment attacking a number of German-held woods east of the village of Monchy. And because of the shift in the boundaries, the 42nd Battalion came out of reserve to fill the gap between the Arras-Cambrai Road and the village of Monchy, pushing past the village and securing a little bit more ground just east of it. By the end of the first day, the Canadian Corps was well inside the German frontline trenches, from the village of Pelves in the north to a bend in the River Cajole in the south, along a line about 1,000 yards east of the village of Monchy-le-Preux. The 27th of August, the 2 divisions attacked again, with a 2-stage plan to break through what's called the Fraise-Ravoy line. So the names of those lines are usually named for the villages that connect them or that they're going through. And so this one connects the village of Fresnay and Ravoy. And that they were to advance about 5 miles. The original plan had only 1 brigade per division attacking each day, so they could stay into action for 3 days. But due to the challenges and resistance, the relief of the 2 divisions had to be planned for a day earlier, which was going to be the 28th of August. The 3rd Canadian Division attacks were to finish capturing the woods that the Royals and the PPCLI had not finished capturing, and then push on to the village of Boiry-Notre-Dame, and then move into the village of Bataille, and then finally into the village of Dury. It was raining, which made this much harder for the 9th Canadian Brigade coming out of divisional reserve to get in position for their 4:55 a.m. attack, and which they did launch somehow on time and capture the 2 woods that had been causing problems with the 52nd and 58th Battalion, and then helped capture the northern part of the village of Vis-en-Artois with the 43rd Battalion. The 116th Battalion moved through to attack Boiry-Notre-Dame, but were halted by stiff resistance and fire, and so ended their day right there. So these photos also come from this. So the photo of the Canadians advancing through the German barrage east of Arras, I don't know which unit they are. They're not identified, but that is from the battle. There, as you can see, they're coming up and you can see shells landing in the background. But the 2 bottom ones are the interesting ones. So that battle that I just talked about, or that part of the battle as they're clearing the village of Vis-en-Artois, the troops on the right are the guys, either 43rd or Battalion or 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. It's not sure that's what the caption says. They are attacking just outside of the village and in a swampy terrain area, which you can actually kind of walk through today. And Canadian troops advancing near the village of Remy, that has to be the 43rd Canadian Battalion, the Cameron Highlanders, because they were the battalion that actually attacked that village. And so that's them moving up one of the roads. You'll notice that the battlefield doesn't look completely destroyed and there's lots of grass. And that's because this battlefield, of course, hadn't been touched in a very, very long time, and there was none of these massive destructive bombardments. The 2nd Canadian Division had to capture the ground between the River Cajole and the River Sensee, a distance of about 2 miles, and then had to take the villages of Vis-en-Artois, Chercy, another 2,000 yards further, and then capture the village of Cagnicourt. The 5th Brigade, which was coming out of divisional reserve, could not get up to the line in time for their dawn attack, and so the 2nd Division attack began at 10 a.m. in broad daylight, with the 4th Canadian Brigade's 18th and 19th Battalions pushing to Vis-en-Artois, but were halted on the banks of the River Sensee. The 5th Brigade attacked down from the high ground at Wancourt Tower, and by noon, the 26th Battalion were over the River Cajole, with the 22nd and 24th Battalions following them. And after taking the village of Chertsey, where they then all faced heavy resistance and were ordered to halt. This day, the 22nd Battalion had lost all of its officers, including its commanding officer, Major Georges Vanier, future Governor General of Canada, who lost his leg. The proposed relief of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions was then postponed because they had to finish capturing their objectives, and it was too hard to pull them out. The 28th of August was a warm and sunny day, and the 9th Canadian Brigade attacked with all of its 4 battalions, the 52nd, 58th, the 116th, and the borrowed 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, as the 43rd Battalion was still tied up in Vis-en-Artois, and punched a hole right through the Fraise-Ravoy line, and then moved to capture a place called Artillery Hill, and finally the village of Boiry-Notre-Dame, which was captured by the 58th Battalion. The 8th Brigade along the road, the Arras-Cambrai Road, using the 43rd Battalion, exchanged with the 9th Brigade, captured a high feature called 70 Ridge and the village of Remy on the west bank of the Sensee River, and that's where those 2 bottom photos are from. In the very north, the 7th Brigade attacked with the 49th Battalion, capturing the village of Pelves and the PPCLI and 42nd, clearing the rest of the way, and a feature called Jigsaw Wood. The 2nd Canadian Division tried for Cagnicourt, but uncut wire, exhausted and depleted units, the 4th Brigade could barely muster a single composite battalion from its 4 units, struggled to make any progress. The 22nd and 24th did make it into the German lines, but were pushed back by 9 p.m. The courage and leadership of the commanding officer of the 24th, who had assumed command of the 24th and took over part of the 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel W.H. Clark Kennedy, who was a company commander at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 and had fought his whole way through the war, was severely wounded. His leg was shattered, and he continued to lead from a shell hole until he was finally evacuated. And due to casualties, a lieutenant took command of the battalion at the end of the day. Lieutenant Colonel William Hugh Clark Kennedy was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on this day in leading his battalion. The end of the Battle of the Scarpe, the Canadians had suffered 254 officers and 5,547 other ranks as casualties, and both divisions were completely exhausted and worn down. But they had just captured 3,300 prisoners of war, 53 artillery pieces, 519 machine guns, and advanced a little over 5 miles or 8 kilometers. The night of the 28th, 29th, the 2nd Canadian Division was relieved by the 1st Canadian Division, and the 3rd Canadian Division was relieved by the British 4th Division, as the 4th Canadian Division had still to finish arriving from Amiens. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, the Corps commander, also deployed the Canadian Corps Cyclist Battalion and the Canadian Motor Machine Gun Brigade, a unique formation of armored cars, and they formed them into a group called Brutinel's Brigade, named after the brigade or the commander of the Canadian Motor Machine Gun Corps, and then it was renamed the Canadian Independent Force. That's basically a mini pocket brigade of very mobile troops, and he put them into the north to hold the flanks. So this is an impressive battlefield. It's quite interesting. They move really fast and hard. So what can you visit from the Battle of the Scarpe? Well, you can visit Orange Hill Cemetery, which is all Canadians on the top of Orange Hill, which is a unique little place. So you can also visit Fouché Chapel Cemetery. There's 20 Canadians there from the battle. Orange Hill, which has 43. Tigers Lane Cemetery, which has 32 Canadians from the battle. Wancourt British Cemetery, which holds 222 Canadians. Monchy British Cemetery, which holds 23. The Vis-en-Artois Cemetery and Memorial, which has 524 Canadians. The 5th Canadian Brigade Memorial just outside of Chertsey, not far from where Hugh Clark Kennedy won his Victoria Cross. The Valley Cemetery, which has 37. Sun Quarry, which holds 153. And if you go into the village of Vis-en-Artois, you can see the location where Claude Nunny won his VC. There's a memorial plaque there. It's interesting because he actually won it at the beginning of the next phase of the next battle, but his plaque happens to be there, and that's what's mentioned in the photo. And it's in Vis-en-Artois. And the VCs in this battle are all marked with these beautiful plaques where they're found, if they know where the actual action took place. Ah, the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant Line, 2 to 3 September 1918. This is a barrier that is formidable and it is impressive. And you can see from the photos how different a battlefield looks from what we're used to seeing on, say, the Somme or Passchendaele. From the 29th of August until the 2nd of September 1918, smaller operations and actions took place to finish clearing the Fresnay-Ravoy line and the Vis-en-Artois switch line, secured the bank of the River Scarpe to the north, completing the capture of the villages of Remy and Haucourt, and taking a feature called Upton Wood, and then finally a place called the Crow's Nest, which was a German fortification. All of these helped prepare for the next attack, the one against the actual Drocourt-Queant line, the outer defenses of the Hindenburg Line. The 4th Canadian Division entered the line beside the 4th British Division with the 12th Canadian Brigade on the Arras-Cambrai Road, and that was because the British had suffered some pretty bad casualties. The plan for the attack involved the 1st Canadian Division with 2 of its brigades, the 2nd and the 3rd, the 4th Canadian Division with 1 brigade, the 12th, and the British 4th Division with one of its brigades, the 33rd. The British 4th Division had suffered serious losses leading up to the main attack, and so they could only put 1 full brigade into the field. So the 4th Canadian Division had to take over half of their front line with a 2nd Brigade, which happened to be the 10th Canadian Brigade that was moved in, and the intent was to break into the Drocourt-Queant line at the Arras-Cambrai Road and then roll it up north and south before driving onto a feature called the Canal du Nord. The opening of the battle was the 2nd of September at dawn with a tremendous crash of a barrage. The 1st Division's most southern units were the 13th and 16th Battalions attacking towards the village of Cagnicourt. The 13th Battalion captured its section of the Drocourt-Queant line by 7:30 a.m. with little resistance, and the 14th Battalion passed through them to capture Cagnicourt, taking an entire German battalion prisoner, and then they dashed another 2,000 yards further to capture the final objective inside what's called the Bussy Switch Line, which was a fortification line that connected 2 of the trench lines. The 16th Battalion attack was slowed by heavy fire and resistance, and then they lost their barrage. 2 members of this battalion performed actions that led them to being awarded the Victoria Cross this day. Lance Corporal W.H. Metcalf, who had already won the military medal, who calmly walked across an open field that was being swept by German fire, basically went up to a tank, got its attention, guided it around, and directed it to knock out German emplacements that was holding up the attack. And then later that day, after they had gotten into the Drocourt-Queant line and they were halted again, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Cyrus Peck, went forward on his own to conduct a reconnaissance, then went back to get tanks to support his men in their attack, and then led them on to their final objective. Once they were on their red line objective, the 15th Battalion pushed through the 16th Battalion and suffered crippling losses when they tried to attack through the Bussy Switch Line. So what's interesting about Lieutenant Colonel Cyrus Peck is he was a member of Parliament, and he's the only Canadian member of Parliament to win the Victoria Cross for his actions. And Lance Corporal Metcalf, they're in the same battalion, and that's really rare. There's only a few instances where 2 men in the battalion on the same day win a Victoria Cross, and I've actually been to roughly where they won their Victoria Crosses, and I've actually been to 2 VC actions where that's happened, and it's pretty impressive that they did that. So that's kind of a rarity. The 2nd Canadian Brigade started with a German counterattack, which was held off by the 5th Battalion, still in hand-to-hand fighting, when their 7th Battalion went forward through them and quickly and easily captured their sections of the Drocourt-Queant line, mostly because the attackers were the defenders of the line. Private W.L. Rayfield rushed ahead of his company and captured a German trench, killing 2 and capturing 10. Then he stormed a position occupied by a sniper who was inflicting casualties and forcing the surrender of another 30 men. And then he carried a badly wounded comrade to safety, all under fire, and he was awarded a Victoria Cross for his actions this day. The 7th Battalion was passed through later by the 10th Battalion at around 8 a.m., and they made good progress until they too were halted in front of Villers-le-Cagnicourt, where they fought through the late afternoon. Sergeant A.G. Knight went forward alone, bayoneting several German machine gun and mortar crews, forcing many to retreat, and then he brought up a Lewis gun, directed his section to fire into the withdrawing Germans, and then, with his platoon following, he charged after 30 Germans he saw running into a bunker, killing their officer and 2 NCOs and capturing the remaining members, all single-handedly. He was mortally wounded later that day, but it was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. At 6 p.m., a barrage was fired, and the weary men took their part of the Bussy switch line at about 11 p.m. On the 4th Canadian Division front, the 12th Brigade attack had to deal with a stubborn German position on the road, but reached its objectives inside the Drocourt-Queant line as planned on time. The 72nd Battalion, Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, captured the ground where the Canadian Dury Memorial stands today. As they and the 38th Battalion attacked a feature called Mount Dury towards a sunken road that connects the village of Dury to the Arras-Cambrai road, they were hit by terrible fire, but overcame and captured it by mid-morning. Private Claude Nunny of the 38th Battalion, as he was preparing to go into action from Vis-en-Artois, was bombarded. He rushed from post to post, helping to encourage his men, as the Germans were putting in a spoiling attack, which they repulsed. He was wounded and died of his wounds 16 days later. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery in this action. The 47th and 50th Battalions of the 10th Brigade had a tough time as the wire in front of them had not been cut by the barrage and had to be done by hand in order to continue and capture their section of the trench lines. And they were passed through later by the 46th, who captured the village of Dury itself. In particularly tough fighting, by 7:30 a.m., they captured 120 prisoners in the village and 9 machine guns. At 8 a.m., the 78th Battalion came through the 72nd Battalion, but made no further progress as it took heavy fire from the yet uncaptured Villers-les-Cagnicourt. And the 11th Brigade units, the 87th, 75th, and 54th, were also held up, and no more progress was made north of the Arras-Cambrai road. 2 Victoria Cross actions actually happened around the village of Dury. Captain B.S. Hutchison, who is an American, the medical officer of the 75th Battalion, and Private J.F. Young of the 87th Battalion, who was a stretcher bearer, both performed acts of gallantry, saving many, many wounded men. The British 4th Division also took its section of the DQ lines, but they were not able to capture the village of Bataille, their final objective, until the next morning. So the top photos, the left-hand side one of the Germans in that road, that's the sunken road. You can actually drive down it today, driven down it many times. Beside that is the 12th Infantry Brigade headquarters, runners and signalers near the village of Dury in a dugout. You'll notice there's lots of bicycles around because that's how they would move around the battlefield. You also see there's lots of trees because this area wasn't as heavily smashed. There's not a lot of trees there today anyways. It's all farmland. So on the bottom, you can see Canadian wounded being dressed in the middle of an open field. And you'll notice there's not a ton of shell holes and damage and grass. So it's interesting change for the Canadians, I'm sure. Those are German prisoners with some Canadian wounded, and as well as they're captured by the 22nd Battalion east of Arras. While the 2nd of September had not met all of its objectives, the Canadian Corps had taken the Drocourt-Queant line, the toughest section of the Hindenburg Line. The orders for the 3rd of September were to continue to push towards the Canal du Nord, but that night the Germans withdrew behind it. Air patrols early in the morning reported no Germans between the Canadian front and the canal, and by noon the entire Canadian Corps was moving, capturing the village of Bussy and all of the villages west of the canal. The attacking divisions were relieved by the British 1st and the Canadian 2nd and 3rd Divisions on the night of the 4th and 5th of September. It had been a costly fight, with another 297 officers and 5,325 men casualties between the 1st and 4th of September, but they captured another 5 kilometers in the north and 8 kilometers in the south. The Battle of Arras had cracked the Hindenburg Line defenses, removed the threat to Arras, and inflicted another significant defeat upon the Germans, forcing them to fall back deep into their Hindenburg Line defenses on the 3rd and the 4th of September, and the Canadians ending their attacks on the west bank of the Canal du Nord, which was part of the main Hindenburg Line defenses. What makes the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant Line very unique is that on the 2nd of September 1918, 7 Canadians performed actions, the most ever awarded to Canadians in a single day, and 2 of them went to men in the same battalion, which was another extreme rarity. The Canadians had a relative quiet rest of the month of September as they were rebuilding and preparing for the next battle. The Battle of the Canal du Nord and Cambrai, the last of the major battles of the 100 Days campaign for Canada. So where can you visit? Well, the first place I need to mention is the Canadian Dury Memorial, which is the top photo. It's one of the 8 memorials commemorating Canada's participation in the First World War. This area was captured by the 72nd Seaforth Highlanders Battalion. It's on the side of the road, and it's just up the road from a traffic circle, which is called 7 VC Corner, which commemorates the 7 Victoria Cross recipients of the battle. Also near here is the Dury Mill and Dury Crucifix cemeteries. They actually both can be seen from the memorial. Dury Mill has 314 and Dury Crucifix has 122 Canadians in it. As well, just down the road from Dury Crucifix Cemetery is the plaque for Captain Hutchison and Private Young's Victoria Cross actions, because they happened near that spot. And they're really quite nice. Not far from here is Dominion Cemetery, which has 211 Canadian and is where Sergeant A.G. Knight VC is buried. He's Canadian, that's his gravestone there. It's hard to get to when it rains. I have been trying to get there all winter, and I'm taking my 4x4 truck the next time I go, because I'm usually in my motorhome or in a bus, and you can't get there in either of those. Cagnicourt British Cemetery has also 25 Canadians, and there's a 15th Battalion Memorial at Marquillon. And there are also plaques to the 16th Battalion at Villers-les-Cagnicourt. As well, there's a German cemetery, Rumecourt German Cemetery, with about 2,600 Germans and 2 Austro-Hungarians that fell in this battle. There are many, many other small cemeteries and memorials, almost too many to mention, but these are some of the big ones that are always worth seeing. As I said, there's too many to mention, but if you can't find them, Google Maps has a whole list of them. You can zoom into this area and you can see cemeteries and memorials all over the place. But driving every road in this area, you can trip over a dozen different battlefield locations, because those roads still exist today. I mentioned the Newfoundland Memorial. It's actually in Monchy-le-Prune. It's from the 1917 Battle of Arras, where they fought there. It's one of their 5 memorials. You should also visit, when you're in Arras, the Arras Memorial, the Flying Services Memorial, the Flambeau d'Amiens Cemetery. There are Canadians there. There's the Carrier Wellington, which is a tunnel complex underneath the city, very similar to the Vimy subways, and it was used by the Canadians in this battle. This area was an entire battlefield, and north, they said, is Vimy Lens, and south is the Somme. And so this is a really great place, and Canada spent a great deal of time here in the First World War, and it's a great way to spend an entire time. If you're doing a tour of First World War Canada, this is a great place to bring people, because you can see everything really easily. So some people comment that Vimy Ridge is the most important battle that Canada ever fought. Many historians today, and at the time, felt that this battle, the Battle of Arras 1918, specifically the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant line, was the most significant strategic operation carried out by Canada in the war. And that is because they literally, along with other divisions from other sides, punched right through the toughest defenses the Germans had and gave them a crushing blow that they could not recover from. So thank you very, very much. And I would love to take any questions that you guys have.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was wonderful. So as
You're
Rob,
welcome.
I'd love to open it up to any questions anyone might have if they'd like to unmute and ask, or please feel free to put their question in the chat and then we can ask Rob as well. Okay, so Richard Williams is asking, how do you think the Battle of Arras ought to be remembered today?
I think it needs to be more celebrated. Most Canadians have never heard of it. If you ask most Canadians, they think we got gassed in 1915, we fought the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and we won the war. Most Canadians have never actually ever heard of Dury or the Dury Memorial. And I wish more people would go there. It should be celebrated and talked about more. We had 7 Victoria Crosses in a single day, which is pretty epic. The British only beat us by 3 or 4 when that was in the 1800s. We are talking, this is the Canadian military at its strongest. It also makes it a little unique because this is when the mass influx of conscripts have now come in. So this is truly a national, all Canadians are in battle. After the Battle of Amiens, most of the conscripts started coming into the Canadian Corps because conscription was a big controversy. But we don't talk about the storming of Monchy-le-Preux. Newfoundlanders barely even know that there's a memorial there too. So this whole battlefield should be really remembered and celebrated, either on its anniversaries or on Remembrance Day. I was there the day after Remembrance Day twice, and there was not a single wreath at it. So that's kind of sad. And I've seen that at several Canadian memorials. Montserrat is like that. This one, Dury, Burlon Wood, and Courcelette. So these are they should be celebrated more, and we should talk about them more, because this is quite the accomplishment. But if you can see the background photo, that's one of the wire barriers behind me in my photo of the Drocourt-Queant line that we attacked through. So this was a pretty huge success.
So Lisa Elliott is asking, was there any new technology used in this battle?
So yes, and I didn't mention it heavily because it's not really mentioned in the narrative, and that's because when it was written in the official history. So yes, so the British for the first time deployed mustard gas. The Germans had used it first in 1917, actually on this battlefield, to try to stop the Brits and the Canadians, the Canadian cavalry units that fought there. And then Canada used it quite heavily on German supply, logistics, and artillery units. So that was kind of the newest thing, but it was also, this is when they kind of perfected the all arms. They used it at Amiens and they mastered it here, where tanks were involved, with infantry, with airplanes acting in a ground attack. There's actually some photos from this battle of airplanes launching what we would call an airstrike today, of German positions just in front of Canadian infantry. So literal close air support. And it was really the culmination of technology. So at this point, there's still lots of horses, but many of the photos of the logistics of this battle are trucks. You will see lots and lots and lots and lots of trucks. Every support picture I've seen is British and Canadian Army Service Corps units driving trucks forward to supply them. So it's kind of the final culmination of the war, technologically speaking. It's all being put into use. But the newest weapon that the Canadians and the British used was gas, and Currie loved to gas the Germans. He did every battle he fought, and in this case, he actually launched 400 cylinders into a valley just to keep the Germans out of it.
And Lisa says, thank you, that's super interesting. That's great. Does anyone else have any questions this evening? Okay, and if you do have any other questions that come up after, you can always feel free to send an email to the email is there at the mfse.virtualprograms@cfmws.com. Please feel free to send any questions if you have them after the session. And our next session is going to be on Thursday, April the 25th at 7 p.m. And it's going to be Battle of the Canal du Nord and Cambria from 1918. So once again, thank you, Rob. We're so lucky to have you share all of your knowledge with us and your passion for this subject. So it's always a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to next month's presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very, very much.
Merci beaucoup, tout le monde.